Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be going over the Fukuoka Champions League results. It's been out for a week or so now. It's the 17th of February this tournament was, and there has been a number of City League data to look at as well post the Champions League, so the meta is starting to evolve around these top 16 performers, but we also have the day 1 to day 2 conversion as well, thanks to Pokeka Book. Whilst we are looking at the Temporal Forces meta, definitely check out the link in the description because that is going to be the community ratings, because we are going to be doing our set review by the end of the week. So we really want to get your thoughts on the Temporal Forces cards before we get our set review underway, because we are starting to ramp up the content now. Throughout the week there is going to be some IRL gameplay because I had Bert's TCG come round to have some games as well. So hopefully we're going to be ramping back up as we start the sort of countdown to the EYC, which I know is going to be a massive tournament for a number of players. So let's start off with the day 1 to day 2 conversion that we have here. By far and away, Charizard was the most played deck. Now, this is going to be both Bibarel and Pidgeot. My assumption is that Bibarel is probably the most prominent, popular way to play Charizard right now. At least that's what the City League data was indicating to me. That's not to say there wasn't a lot of Pidgeot. There still probably was, I would say, maybe 10% of this 27, if I was to pick a number out of thin air. So there's going to still be the sort of tried and trusted that we are aware of, the Pidgeot Charizard builds that were very popular and played, as well as Bibarel engines. Let's not forget though that Bibarel was already a very popular engine for them when the TM evolution was first printed, so we're going to have to sort of make our own stance and decide whether the Bibarel or Pidgeot engine is superior ourselves once again, but that is going to be by far and away the most popular deck with that 27% play rate on day 1. Then we have Chien-Pao and Lossome Box, very similar in their play rates, both 10.8 and 10.2% respectively. We have Arceus Giratina, definitely kind of the flagship build of Arc right now, although there are other builds, and we will look at the second place list, which is a vastly different build altogether. The idea of pairing Arc with Giratina, however, is that you naturally play Grass Energy, so you have an Iron Leaves EX answer into Charizard EX with weakness, and then you also have the Maximum Belt, which can also allow you to one-hit KO Charizard EX as well as other Stage 2 EX Pokemon. So the sort of damage ramp that you gain from Arc is quite appealing alongside the Giratina now. Lugia, quite popular, as well as the new Ancient Toolbox, the one prize build of Roaring Moon. Then there is still some decent representation for EX builds of Roaring Moon, as well as Giratina Vstar and Goldengo, before we have the 17% of sort of other decks that are split between like 2 and 1%ers or whatnot. As we get to the performance of decks from day 1 to day 2, even though Charizard was the most popular deck in the room, it actually increased its percentage up to 31.5% of the day 2 fields, which is really impressive for a deck so popular. Even with so many mirror matches going on, it seemed to be beating enough of the other decks in the room to still have a very, very strong conversion. Going from day 1 to day 2 would have been an X2 record, I believe, in their best of 1 Swiss rounds. So I think it had to be at least 7-2 to progress into day 2 of the competition. So that's a lot of great records for Charizard players, even though it was played in huge numbers. Chien-Pao also had a really favourable conversion, as did Lugia, jumping from, I think, the 5th most popular deck all the way up to the 3rd most popular in day 2. I think both Chien-Pao and Lugia are fairly strong decks into Charizard, so it doesn't surprise me when a field is so focused on beating one archetype that these sort of foils, these checks, these counter archetypes, you could say, are doing quite well in this field. It's a pretty natural thing to expect. Arc Giratina not doing all that well, neither was the Lossome Box. Giratina Vstar doing okay for itself. The Ancient Box didn't do that great, and Snorlax jumps into the graphic as it also had a really, really good conversion. That means that both the Roaring Moon EX and the Goldengo didn't have a great time. They can be found in much lower percentages in that sort of 15.5% other category alongside the other decks that made it in 1s and 2s. As we get into the top 16 decks themselves though, Snorlax, Arceus and Charizard were the big winners, each of them getting 3 placements in that top 16. Lossome Box had 2 converting, so even though it had a pretty poor overall conversion, a couple did make it up into those higher echelons. And then we had 5 archetypes which feature once in our top 16. It was actually a Lugia archetype which was able to take down the entire tournament. There are a few big upgrades from the new set coming out, Chinchino being this new flagship attacker that we have, a very very dangerous beat stick single prize Pokemon. With the help of double Primal Turbo plus turn attachment, you can be dishing out 350 damage with this Pokemon. It basically can't be ignored, otherwise they're going to run away with the prize race, so it forces your opponent to go through single prize options. The deck is very dangerous once it gets set up. A couple other new cards, it's choosing the Master Ball A spec because this deck is all about getting that turn 2 summoning star, so having that guaranteed Arceus, grabbing that guaranteed Lugia Vstar, possibly even Luminion to unlock some of your supporter cards, is important enough to play in this archetype over the other powerful A specs we have in the game. And there's also the Mist Energy, which is a helpful card to have against Giratina Vstar as well as Roaring Moon, as you are preventing effects of attacks done to your Pokemon. Even though it looks really strange to play a 3/3 line of another stage 1 coming into the deck list, the upsides of when you are able to summon turn 2 are massive. You get to have a much more single prize based focus. Your opponent basically can't ignore the Chinchino in the active, so leave your Archeops around the board for the entire game. You do have decent bulk and tempo at your disposal just by attacking with Lugia Vstar in the opening stages, and you also fill your deck with 4 copies of Jet Energy, which is actually pretty important with the amount of stalling and controlling archetypes that are available in our formats going into this new set. The second place deck list is also really interesting. It was an Arceus Alolan Vulpix Vstar build, quite different to the sort of aggressive attacking list that you'd expect from the Giratina side of things. The Alolan Vulpix Vstar is simply trying to slow the opponent down. The Snow Mirage attacks prevents all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from Pokemon that have an ability. It's clearly trying to cover a huge number of Pokemon all in one go. It's certainly a pain for Charizard players to get around this, also going to be good against Goldengo, Chien-Pao. It does cover a lot just with a single attack. And when you are not trying to attack with your Vulpix, you do have, just good old-fashioned bulky Arc Vstar. You see a 4/4 line in the deck list just to have that very reliable turn 2 Starbirth, which is certainly a reasonable choice. There is the Radiant Greninja as the only single prize Pokemon in the deck list, which can be used to offset the prize race. There are a couple other new cards coming into the Arceus deck. You often see the Mist Energy come into the deck list to again help out against the Giratina Vstar matchup, as well as Roaring Moon. Prime Catcher was the A-spec choice in this occasion. There is actually a lot of variety in choice with Arceus builds. Oftentimes you see the Hero Cape in these frustrating tanky builds of Arceus, but the Prime Catcher is obviously a justifiable choice here. We'll take a look at some Giratina builds in a moment, which are mainly using the Maximum Belt, however. A cool note about the Arceus build, and actually a number of the Arceus builds that we'll look at that did the best over this tournament, were playing the Eerie Supporter, allowing you to look at your opponent's hand and discard 2 item cards. This can be really good at sniping Ultra Balls from Lugia players, possibly even Charizard players as well. Rare Candies, of course, for stage 2 archetypes. Getting rid of things like Superior Energy Retrieval against Chien-Pao just seems like a really versatile option. And in many occasions, this could be your Starbirth option instead of an early game Judge or Iono, trying to slow the opponent down. It looks like with the double copy of Professor Cherry's scenario, there will be situations where you try and go lone Vulpix in certain situations, or simply have Arceus tanking and healing into some lower damage output matchups. There's even copies of the Medical Energy in here, which is an attach heal 30, which I never thought I'd see. But there you go, it does lean into the healing playstyle of this list. Jumping down to the other Arceus builds in top 8, there was 2 Tina variants where, like I mentioned, having Maximum Belt and Iron Leaves EX allows you to be a little bit more aggressive into Charizard at the very least. There's 2 copies of Eri in one of the lists, and just combine that with a couple copies of TM Devolution. This actually could allow you to run out Chien-Pao players and Charizard players of Rare Candy and leave them with very few options to continue the game, which I think is pretty interesting overall. I didn't expect to see TM Devolution when you're already playing Leaves and Max Belt, but I think it mostly chips in more against the Chien-Pao players and every now and then catches the Charizard players off guard. There's also the Radiant Gardevoir in the deck list. I think this is somewhat of a mirror tech and also helping out against Lost Zone builds of Giratina, which is still relatively popular. And of course, the deck is still mostly focusing on good old Judge in the opening stages. You no longer have that Path to the Peak to accompany the Judge, unfortunately. Sometimes you'll see League HQ, sometimes you'll see Lost City. In this case, it's just going for Collapse Stadium and Vacuum, which is perfectly reasonable as well. But it looks like Arceus is still finding ways to go deep into tournaments by spamming Hand Disruption at the opponent and having Barrel Squover at your own disposal. There was a few adjustments with the other top 860. There was a couple copies of Capturing Aroma making it into the deck list, as well as a 4th count of the Arc Vstar just to get into the game. But interestingly, there were 2 copies of Grabber to help inform your decision of whether to Starbirth for Eri or for Judge, which I thought is a really cool thing to have in the deck list. And you'll notice just the choice of Lost City over any other stadium here. Moving on to Control then, which had a phenomenal tournament overall, making top 4 in the highest placement and a couple other placements among that top 16 as well. Once again, that Eerie Supporter is a really terrifying card to have here, where rather than banking on Misfortune Sisters taking cards from the top of your opponent's deck and really crossing your fingers, you now have more immediate access to your opponent's hand when trying to target down their switching cards, which is of course a key resource you're looking to remove from your opponent so you can find things to block throughout the game. Hero's Cape is the obvious A-spec choice here to try and gain some bulk on your Pokemon, without the key downside of Luxurious Cape, where you are giving up additional prizes if your opponent is able to get through your Pokemon. There's still a heavy emphasis on Temple of Sinnoh, because Jet Energy is a key card for Lugia players, a number of Arceus builds, and still some Lost Zone decks. Chi-Yu EX is just like Abominable, but has slightly less hit points, but is still that proactive mill option. And naturally, playing Fire Energy in your deck list can bait your opponent into playing around Radiant Charizard, as it can be a terrifying late game threat, and can be a deterrent to opponents who are just trying to get one Pokemon into play, trying to swing every turn. Just by seeing Fire Energy makes your opponent play differently around you, which I think is a really big deal for the deck. There were a couple variations within the deck list. In this one, you'll notice that there is the Mantine. The Mantine allows you to pull a Pokemon from an opponent's discard pile onto their bench. Essentially, it's the effect of an Echoing Horn, but in an attack. It's not ideal, but it's another way that you can try and bring more Pokemon into the action for counter-catcher plays. There's still the Giacomo in this list, which can be more proactive discard for special energy as well. And the top 16 list got really creative with a 1/1 line of the Noivern EX, which has the Covert Flight attack, dealing 70 and prevents all damage done to this Pokemon by the attacks from basic Pokemon. With the combination of this and Mist Energy, you actually cover yourself against Ancient Box, Roaring Moon EX, some future-based decks and Miraidon builds, and almost all the Lost Box variants which aren't incorporating a 1/1 Vstar package. Squover is a cute single prize option which attacks for colourless energy, which sort of fits the build here when you are incorporating the Noivern compared to Chi-Yu. It only discards one card from the top of the opponent's deck, but it's still going to accelerate your win condition. And despite the funky 1/1 package, it's still in keeping with the deck's overall game plan into so many matchups. So the touted best deck in format didn't flop. Charizard actually did pretty well this tournament, having good day 1 to day 2 conversion and having 3 decks in that top 16, including this one in top 4. It is a Bibarel based build of Charizard. As I said towards the start of the video, it is one of the more popular builds right now. I do think the Bibarel build forces a single prize map into a number of matchups, which is pretty important as you get towards the mid to late game. And I do think one of the big downsides of Bibarel is slightly alleviated with the 2 copies of the Cryptomaniac's Deciphering, which allows you to put 2 cards on top of your deck for you to simply incisor straight into them. Prime Catcher is the go-to A-spec for this build of Charizard, which incorporates Bibarel, I think in part because you just have high retreat cost Pokemon from the Bibarel itself, as well as Radzard in the deck inherently, compared to a Pidgeot build which has natural free retreaters and leans into that maximum belt a little bit more. This is also the first deck list that incorporates the Buddy Poffin that we haven't talked about yet. It's a monstrously good item card that's going to be used in all sorts of evolution decks and some Lost Zone engines as well, because it's able to get 2 70 hit point or less Pokemon onto your bench immediately. Not too different from the top 16 Bibarel-based engine, still having that pretty thick Bibarel line. It's incorporated a slightly higher count of Nest Ball as well as Iron Bundle, so you can push some Pokemon out of the way in the opening stages, and it's got the Defiance belt in here over Vitality Band. You'll also notice there's not a big emphasis on Arven in here, and no TM Evolution either. There are a number of lists in Japan that are choosing to play Bib without TM Evolution altogether, and simply leaning to that Bibarel to be your sort of Iono-proofing mechanism throughout the game. Despite the major success of Bibarel, Pidgeot also did quite well, where we see the traditional 4 Arven, 4 Candy, 2 Pidgeot EX that we've come used to in the West. For me, it's a big surprise to see the Hero's Cape introduction here, as almost every City League has gone for the maximum belt in this version of Charizard. Ironically, I think it's actually really good against Lugia, so if that deck continues to pick up steam, it could be the correct choice for this list. I really do like this 60, I don't think there's much clutter in the list at all, and I do think double counter catcher is also a huge deal right now in Charizard. We have seen it in the past see success, so I do think this is a perfect neck deck if you want to have a decent start with the Charizard Pidgeot build. Lost Zone seems to come out fairly unscathed from rotation. It did have a decent top 8 placement. The Buddy Poffin comes in to replace Battle VIP Pass. Prime Catcher gives you extra ways of dipping with Flower Selects throughout the entire game, and gives you that guaranteed gust from an item card, meaning that even when you are getting hit with Iono throughout the game, you have the option of hitting your Colress or Roxanne and still having gust on your turn. And the emergency board does give you a little bit of on-board protection from Iono as well, knowing that you can use your Confate as a pivot when your attackers are getting frequently KO'd. The core of the Lost Zone deck is still going to be good old Iron Hands and Roaring Moon, giving you 1-hit KO options on lower hit point single prize decks as well as really high hit point multi-prizes. This isn't too dissimilar from lists we've seen in the past do well. I do think the stadium count is slightly contentious, where there's certainly an argument to look towards a number of Pokestop or possibly Town Store, because of course the Forest Seal Stone is a massive deal, and I'd also love to work in some Pokegear into the list as always. There was a Crisis Punch that got weaved into the other Lost Zone box list, but also very similar counts going on with this one. We then have the brand new single prize archetype from Temporal Forces, the Ancient box. The new Roaring Moon's Vengeful Feathers attack is the kind of build around of the deck where you have 70 plus 10 damage for each Ancient card in your discard pile. This deck list is playing 29 Ancient cards total, so we can wrap this into 1-hit KO range, certainly of basic EX Pokemon, and as we work towards the late game, we can fairly comfortably get to Vstar range. I do think it's still tricky to get into 1-hit KO territory for the likes of Charizard EX, for example, but the idea of the deck is that you're going to be coming out the gate swinging, taking some early prizes, and and hoping that towards the latter stages, you'll have enough of a prize buffer to two-shot your way to victory. The Ancient Drum is a no-brainer choice here, where we are filling our deck with a number of ancient Pokemon already, and this provides extra draw power within the deck, whilst also being a plus 10 damage modifier effectively as soon as we play it. Koraidon's definitely a reasonable backup attacking option, and we simply want to have more decent leads in the deck so we can get swinging in the opening stages. Fluttermane can be a pesky lead Pokemon, shutting down some crucial abilities, and Great Tusk isn't always going to get into the mix, but can be a surprise win condition if your opponent's not prepared for it. The new Explorer's Guidance is a pretty synergistic card within the deck list. Obviously, it's an ancient card itself, so is naturally adding to your overall count to hit the discard pile, but the Explorer itself helps in this endeavor, as you're looking at the top 6 cards and binning 4 of them and keeping 2. It's a pretty intricate deck actually, where you are trying to juggle your resources towards the late game, whilst making sure you've pitched enough to get the most out of your Vengeful Feathers for key knockouts. The cards that kind of stick out to me is the 1 Superior Energy Retrieval and the 2 Trekking Shoes. Superior looks like an absolute meme, but it's actually really powerful in this archetype. It's obviously another way of discarding 2 ancient cards out of the hand immediately, but it actually unlocks your Greninja to be a usable card throughout the mid to late game, which I found was sometimes a struggle within the list. The one thing I will say though is that oftentimes in the opening stages you want to get not only Greninja but also a couple ancient Pokemon in the mix early, so I personally would shift those Trekking Shoes into Ultra Balls. I think they're far stronger cards overall in the list. That sentiment is actually reflected with the senior winning deck list, which did incorporate a couple copies of Ultra Ball. It also had Slitherwing in the deck list, which I also agree with. I do think giving yourself some fighting type coverage is naturally pretty reasonable, especially because there's a future box list that we'll look at in a moment, which is going aggressively in towards the Iron Hands route, so having an instant response on that seemed pretty important to me. Another thing the seniors list played was Pokestop, and I think I prefer having the Ultra Ball plus Pokestop combination to the Masters 60 was playing Artisan and Trekking Shoes. I think you're naturally just getting more mileage out of Pokestop throughout the majority of turns, and I think with Palpad in the mix, you have enough control over what's getting discarded with your Pokestop throughout the game anyway. Giratina Vstar is a far cry from its former strength with Path of the Peak rotating, but it still has found a way to do reasonably in this format, still has that one-hit KO potential, and does have Iron Leaves in the deck list to give you another one-hit KO option into Charizard at the very least. I was intrigued to see the Forest Hill Stone make its way into Giratina. It's something we've seen a number of times from Japan. I was also terrified at the thought of such a low Buddy Poffin count, but the overall shell of the deck is very similar to what we've already seen in the past. Great Tusk is a new milling archetype, the intention being that you use that Crust Collapse every single turn of the game after having used a Professor Sada or Explorer's Guidance, so that you are getting a full 4-card mill from the opponent. It's essentially a new age version of Durant, and the Great Tusk can also be buffed up with hit points with the Ancient Booster Capsule, the Bravery Charm, or the A-Spec of the deck, the Hero's Cape. The deck list that ended up doing pretty well is quite unorthodox really, where it has incorporated a couple emergency board as well as Comfey. You very rarely see this in Great Tusk builds, but in fairness, this does give you a little bit more reach every turn of the game. Eerie also makes it into this deck. Even though it's really slowing down your active mill, sometimes getting rid of some crucial resources from the opponent overall gains you more time, more turns throughout the game to mill the opponent eventually. And then we end on the really interesting Iron Hands sort of future box deck straight from Jake Gearhart's Nightmare Laboratory, where you are trying to buff up Iron Hands EX's damage output with the new Iron Crown EX. You can have multiple of these on board, stacking the buffs on your future Pokemon, and the single prize Miraidon offers some great early game energy acceleration, can take some KOs onto lower hit point evolving Pokemon, as well as Comfey, whilst building up Pokemon in the back. This could also be a sort of panic reload in the mid game. We do have 3 Ionos in the deck list, giving you a bit of a fallback if your Generators whiff, or if your Baton gets vacuumed away, you can go for the Iono attack option and try and force the opponent down the single prize route. The deck list is actually really interesting and leans quite heavily into the gift energy aspect of the deck to be a means of protecting yourself against hand disruption. Because the Iron Hands is such a monster threat and has so many energy attached to it, the opponent basically can't ignore this option, so gift energy is constantly proccing to give yourself high hand sizes. Once you've initiated that prize race and the opponent throws hand disruption at you, you always have this gift energy fallback. There's also the Reboot Pod as the A-Spec choice here. I have seen a number of lists go between this card and Prime Catcher. The Reboot Bot is essentially just more guaranteed energy acceleration, which can never be understated, but the Prime Catcher can also just give you more control over your prize map, and that's actually a big component of this deck list, how you map correctly. Because you are only playing Counter Catcher in this deck list, it's going to be really important for you to try and carve out 3 prize turns with an Ampy Very Much play, or force your opponent to take a single prize throughout the game so you can allow them to go down to 1 prize card remaining before getting your final Gust KO. This is a really creative list and very different from the sort of more toolbox boxy type coverage list of Future Box that we've seen in the past leans much more heavily into saying that Iron Hands is absolutely OP, especially when you have these mods of Future Booster and Crown at your disposal. This does seem like one of those decks that was really a cat out the bag and your opponent wasn't really knowing what to play around, but this deck list has continued to do well in City Leagues after the Champions League tournament, so I do think there's certainly something here. So that's it. That wraps up the Champions League tournament. A really interesting one to watch. I do employ to look back at some of the games. I know there's been a number of content creators who have done some post-commentary if you want to hear about it. Let me know your thoughts on the video down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.